Since SJWs entered academia, there's been a lot of left-leaning colleges and universities, especially in the United States, but I think that extends to other places like Europe now. And I think we're even seeing a lot of left-leaning teachers are teaching primary school age kids, and so our studies have this giant bias towards a lot of kind of SJW mentality, and I just thought it might be a nice little thought experiment to say what I think like an ideal school would teach these days. I mean, obviously I'm a lay person, I am not like a professor or anything, but as someone who was a student in the past, before all the SJW stuff, and you know, seeing, I mean, each of us could do this, to be honest, seeing how schools taught us and what we could see as the improvements to how a school system runs. I like to just give like my personal view of like what would be the ideal school these days if it was like, I mean, it would be biased. It's not going to be an unbiased school, but my opinion of what should be taught in schools. And obviously this is just my current 2018 view. My views will change over time, but this is like autumn 2018 what I think. If you ask me in 2 years, I'll probably say something else, but on with the show! So when I was at school, it was before most of this SJW stuff took over the schools. But towards the end of uni, things came in on my end of things, like postmodernism I had to study at uni, which was a load of bullshit, as I've since discovered. And actually I thought back then it was a load of bullshit, because if you try and look into it, it's very self-contradicting and confusing. And I don't know why we were just focusing on this thing as art students. I guess media students, but art students. That was a mess. But there were little gender studies courses coming in, and I know that gender studies has been a big fuck up for unis and colleges recently, and then they brought in all these rather racist courses like black studies, and they started segregating classrooms and stuff. So I'd throw all of that out, none of that. And I mean, there's plenty of videos online for what is in gender studies these days, if you want to see what that is, if you are of my generation, not the millennial generation. I have my own bone to pick with that generational thing, but that'd probably be a different video sometime. So what do you start with for a school? I'm going to focus on like primary school to high school years, and what you would teach kids that they probably essentially need to learn these days in the current climate, you know, in the context of modern times. And I'd have to start with what we were taught in my high school and my primary school. You know, what are the basic lessons that you would go into school for? So just to jog my memory of the sort of subjects I had to study and the sort of things you'd normally get. You get things like mathematics, science, PE, art, music, drama, history, geography, health, media, computer studies, like IT, science, physics, biology, chemistry, HE, home economics, RE, religious studies, DT. It seems a lot of schools are different from what I can work out. There's a whole host of different subjects. But I think we should boil these down and mix subjects together to turn them into single subjects, and then each module will explain the things you need there. But some subjects I'd want to keep separate. I'd probably do them in different orders from other people. So here's the ideal subjects I'd have in my own ideal school. Forgive me if I'm missing anything vital out. So due to the incursion, I'll go straight in at the top with a lesson I would call something like Politics and Ideological Awareness. Now the politics one would slot easily into high school. The ideological awareness part of it, a simplified version, could be taught in primary school, and I would say late primary school, because you don't want to, some of this stuff you really don't want to teach the kids early. They've got enough other stuff on their hands. A lot of these would be for high school, to be honest. So this ideological awareness thing would be teaching things like all the different ideological movements there are that people find themselves getting into. You know, you become part of this tribe, this named movement. So you've got things like Nazism and communism, and it would teach you about individualism versus collectivism. It would teach you about the right versus the left. It would teach you about all sorts of... It would teach you about sort of semi-religious movements like Scientology. It would teach these things as if you're an outsider looking at these things like an alien. Like, well, what are these things that humans, for some reason, there's a lot of humans out there in the world and they get into these things. What are they? How does it happen? What is the idea behind each one? And how do people fall into these things? And then what are the effects it produces, like the wars between the tribes, left and right, collectivist, individualist, rights, religious versus atheist. And the main goal of this thing would be to teach kids earlier about, and it would feed into history as well, it would teach them about the dangers of communism and Nazism specifically. And it wouldn't just focus on one, it would focus on both, as, you know, these are horrible things and they're sort of opposites in a way, depending on how you see them. A lot of people frame them as opposites, but there are other ways of being in between them or around them. It would probably teach you things like objectivism exists, like the Ayn Rand stuff. You know, it would go into... There's so many movements out there. It would probably talk about postmodernism and art movements. It would basically anything that you see classed as an ideological movement of some kind would be taught here. Moving on, I know this would probably piss a lot of people off from the left, but a British integration lesson. And this would be for all students of all backgrounds, and if you're in a different country, it would be, you know, an American integration lesson or a German integration lesson. It would be a sort of lesson that says, what does your country expect from you while you're living here? And I think it would focus on very moderate things, but things that are kind of expected from someone living here, like try and be polite to people in your neighbourhood, try and say hello to people, get on with people, be kind, learn how to have politeness boundaries when engaging with people, but do try and get involved to a certain small amount in the community. But you're free to back off from the community, but if you back off from the community, don't create this kind of hive culture, especially if your family originates from a different country. Don't try and focus on that culture, because if you're living here, you are British first and foremost. So you have to integrate, and you have to be sure to know the language, a tiny amount of history, a tiny amount about like the basics of what the country is, where it comes from, why it's different from the other countries, and what is expected of you if you live here compared to other countries. And it would be things like that, basically. Things to prepare people so as the kids grow up they won't get into conflicts with people generally out on the street every time they go out. Something like that. Next, this would be my own personal baby. This would be something I'd probably flesh out in a different video or something. It would tie into history, it would tie into geography, it would tie into politics, it would tie into internet studies, and I would term it scale studies. So basically scale studies is it's kind of a fun lesson, but also a very, very depressing lesson once kids get to the end of it. And it would sort of focus on kids grasping scale of all varieties and how colossal scale is and how to get an internal, in your head, vision of the scale of things. Now what am I talking about? I'm talking about perceiving crowd sizes, like what does 40 people look like? How many people can you know or get to know before you lose the ability to you start losing connection with the people and forgetting people's names and forgetting who they are? And what does it look like when someone quotes a number, like a number of people? What does that crowd look like in real life? Especially when you're talking like battlefield statistics in history. Like, how many people were at this battle? Well, there was 100,000 people at this battle. How many people died in this tsunami? There was 300,000 people died in this tsunami. How many people is that when they're in front of me? Am I able to get a sense of that when looking down? And it's not going to give you anything particularly data driven. I think it's about a perception thing, because you're also going to go into like how many people post like a picture of a certain specific kind of thing per day. How many kids are born per second, per hour? How large is the Earth compared to the largest planet in our solar system? How large is our sun compared to the largest sun that ever was? How big is the universe? How can we get into our heads how can we perceive what a light year is? What are methods we can use to try and perceive distance and space and deep time? Like, how can we get our heads around the fact that World War One was 100 years ago, and America was born 200 years ago, and that humans have existed for this tiny, minuscule point, whereas dinosaurs and prehistoric life have existed way more than us and doing way less than we've done. And what's going on with overpopulation and how is it actually affecting people when each individual person draws a certain amount of resources each, and you put that down to a number, and then you try and show the number and tie it to that person, and then you try and show the 7 billion population, and then you try and show the finite resources. It's like the whole thing is just like a perception of how can we even begin to perceive the overwhelmingness of the world, and telling a kid, actually, before you even see everything, how overwhelming is everything. And then I think at first it'd be really exciting being shown, because you could visually show a lot of this stuff. And then at the end of the course, kids might come out feeling so overwhelmed that they'll start trying focusing on the small stuff, and they'll have a sense of insignificance kind of early, and they'll have this kind of inbuilt meaning in their minds that they can make an impact by not trying to affect the world as a whole themselves, because a lot of people fall into these kind of traps. Then we just go on to some basic subjects like geography. So geography is a very important one. There's a great channel on YouTube called Geography Now. Geography, it might be an easy one to teach, but it could be that someone tries focusing on race and ethnicity and putting one country above another, and then putting their own thoughts on what we should do and what we shouldn't do. that has no place in geography. That's kind of politics, especially left-wing control politics, like wanting to show people, how we can control the world to be a certain thing. That has no place in geography, if you ask me. You should teach it objectively. Like, here is the world. Here are the countries. There are nations. There are borders between the countries. Certain demographics live here and here and here. Here's a list of each country, what you'd expect to find in each country. Here's a module, like for a couple of months, we're going to learn about navigation. We're going to take you up on the moors, on Dartmoor or Scottish Highlands, and we're going to teach you how to use maps and grid references and learn to walk around. Even if you're on your, we could teach them Google Earth and stuff, but I think it'd be good to teach them like old-fashioned how people got around in history with paper maps and how people did stuff before then even. And you teach them the Age of Exploration, which is a historical period, but you teach them about what it's like trying to map a world that you don't actually know. And then you could apply that to Mars, and you could apply that to other planets that we might visit in the future. Or we could see what's underground, and we could see what's in the sky, and then maybe there'd be a little, lead into astronomy, but that would be with the science lessons later. But there'd be a nice little link there. You could teach a tiny bit of astronomy. Must teach that to kids. Astrology would have very little to no place, except in maybe the religious lessons. Astronomy, the study of the stars, however, could be a feature of geography lessons, I think. Now we move on to RE, religious education. I think it has a place. I don't think we should just teach atheism and evolution, but I think that should be taught. I don't think we should just teach creationism and Christian view of the world, but I think that should be taught. My RE education in high school was pretty good, to be honest. We were taught about all sorts, Jainism, Buddhism. The thing is, we had a religious teacher teaching us this stuff, but she wasn't doing it in a biased way. And I think that the thing about teaching RE is you could easily fall into the trap of having a teacher of RE who was biased to their own religion. And I think each individual person would fit into either a religion or a non-religion that is taught within RE, which would mean they could easily get biased when teaching that subject. But I reckon you can find people out in the world who are not biased toward their own religion. And I think Jordan Peterson is one. I think I would trust Jordan Peterson, even though I know he's a Christian. I would trust him to teach atheism to a class, teach that there's a non-belief in God. And I'd trust him to teach all the other religions, that each religion is different. Some people choose a different religion. Some people to choose the lifestyle that goes with it, and the outlook and views. And it would tie slightly, as I said before, into the ideological awareness and politics lessons at the start. But this would mainly be saying, look, there's atheism, there's Jainism, there's Sikhism, there's Buddhism, there's Islam, there's Christianity, there's different sections of Christianity, there's spiritualism, paganism. All these things exist, but we'd be teaching them as, you're an outsider looking in. Even if the kid was already basically in a religion, they'd be taught, what if you're an outsider looking in? There's all these people in all these different little factions here. Why are they in them? It's okay to be in them, you should respect them if they're in them, but you should know that if you are non-religious at the moment and you choose one of these religions as your own religion, or a non-religion like atheism, this should prepare kids for who they're going to be at war with in future, who's going to be against them, and historically why. Like, if you pick to be an atheist because you don't think you believe in God, who's going to be at your throats most of the time, and why? You know, and if pick any of the other religions, the same thing would apply. Like, who historically has been warring against these religions? Like, Christianity and Islam have had this spat because of the Crusades, and throughout history all sorts of things happened. So it would sort of tie into history a bit as well. Now I bumped into art and computer stuff, and then film studies and media and game, and I got into trouble because I was going to keep them separate initially, but these all kind of linked together in a big hodgepodge, if you ask me. And there's a lot of left-wing bias in art, and also I did put art-necessary, because I've always held that, even though I've loved art and I am an artist, I've always held that art is sort of morally unfulfilling. Being an artist, being an actor, making some music or something, it's not exactly engineering. I argued with one of my uni friends in a pub late at night once about, like, how could art be morally fulfilling, and I think he was coming to the conclusion that you'd be providing happiness to people, and I just thought that was a bit of a kind of half measure, to be honest. I thought there wasn't much purposefulness in art beyond, this looks good, it keeps me happy in my spare time, it helps my imagination, it helps me enjoy my time off when I'm away from work, sort of thing. It keeps me going, else I'd be bored forever and I wouldn't have much will to live. I think that's the purpose of art, basically, is it keeps you going, it inspires you, it keeps your mind sharp, and it's something you indulge in, it's something you like doing in your spare time, away from the important things that you need to do. But there's lots of stuff that mix in with that. So I would actually come up with this thing, I don't know about the name, I've called it media culture. Thinking about it, that sounds like a bullshit name. And I know a lot of people are against the term studies, but I still put studies at the end of some of these lessons. Media, what would you call it? Let's just call it like media, arts and IT or something. So you'd have art within it, you learn about paintings from history, you learn about modern art. There's not much to learn because you could learn all this accidentally by just going on the internet, going on DeviantArt, going on Wikipedia, just walking about the world, basically, going outside and walking around and looking at things. There's not really, there's not too much to teach, and I do see a big chunk of meaninglessness about a lot of this stuff. Like, this is something you could be doing in your spare time away from school and just looking at stuff and helping it inspire you. I think maybe something that should be taught is that other things are a lot more important than these subjects. But then you've also got IT, computer studies, internet learning. That's going to be a big part of this media and IT lesson thing. You'll have a module called Internet Learning, which I assume would have to be one of the biggest parts of this whole thing. There'd also be game design and programming. You don't need a lesson for game design. When I was at high school, there were no high school lessons or uni courses or anything to do with game design in education. And what I learnt of game design, I just learnt from tutorials on the internet and real people and stuff. There weren't any lessons of game design, and I'm really kind of shocked and surprised that there are even lessons on game design in schools. Just seems wrong to me. But there'd be a tiny bit of that, like just maybe talking about gaming history and gaming culture and stuff. There wouldn't be much to it, like there wouldn't be much to the art side, in my opinion. But you'd have some film studies too. I did film studies at school. I think it would teach you more about the old films, like the birth of Hollywood, cinematography, film noir in particular, and how you frame a scene, how you use lighting, how you use sound to create mood, how you make metaphors out of shots, stuff like that. But yeah, the internet part of it would probably be a big part, and you'd be learning about social media and how it has analogues in the real world, and how multiple people are trying to control it, and how the internet is different from the real world, but how it links into the real world, and what bad effects it can have on people, and how you control your own time on the internet. That's the sort of things you'd study there. So there'd be PE. I don't know what's changed in PE, to be honest. Maybe if there's some younger people around, they can tell me what exactly PE consists of these days. For us, it was you just do a different sport each day, or each week there'd be a different sport rather that you'd be involved in, and you'd have a taster of each of the sports, I guess, and then sometimes you'd pick a sport to further on. You wouldn't get much chance of that really. They'd just tell you what sport you're going in, and you'd get fit, you'd do running, you'd play football, you'd play rugby, you'd do judo, you'd do swimming, all these things. I don't see why you'd get rid of that, because everyone needs to be kind of fit and healthy. You'd probably teach the health lessons, which I'm going to come to later, as a co-thing to the PE lessons, and the HE food lessons. We'll come to that. I'm not going to get into this too deeply because it would just be a mess, but there would be sex education lessons, obviously. The sex education lessons would be, like, as an outsider looking in, again, like, just explain to people objectively how many different kinds of sexuality there are, how many ways of having sex people have. Like, there are asexuals, there are monogamous people, there are what's the other word? Not analogous. Fucking hell. Anatomous. Fuck! What's that word? Oh, fuck. Polygamous. Polygamy. Yes. So, yeah. You would teach all the different kinds of sexual preferences that people have. You would specifically teach them the health side of it, like, what is sex, how does it work, scientifically how does it work with the sperm going into the egg and all that, health-wise how does it work, staying free of STDs, using condoms, behaviour-wise how does it work, the whole consent thing that the feminists want would go in, but there'd be a big bit on relationships between men and women and how you maintain that strongly, and that would help most of the traditionalists and the monogamous people, and right-wing people would appreciate that. The right-wing people probably wouldn't appreciate that I would still teach that there are trans people out there, and there are people who decide that they have this thing called gender, but I would teach that biological sex is the main thing. It's the dichotomy, the man and woman, and then gender expression is the side thing. And I would teach that it's a kind of fashion. I would teach that it's a thing that you can choose, and people may not respect it, and you shouldn't get offended at that. But if they're polite, and if you tell them that, you are this thing, and you go about it in a very kind of polite and easygoing way, they'll probably go along with you, and they'll probably respect your identity as much as I don't like any of that shit. But I would teach them that they have no control over how other people perceive them if they choose a gender identity, and that I would also make it known that that is a minority position and most people aren't actually like that. And it's a minority kind of fringe group sort of thing, because that is the truth. More importantly, on the side of sex education, I would have this thing called relationship studies. Obviously, I can tell there's alarm bells going off for some people, but I think it's something I missed in school was that everyone taught sex education. It's like, oh wow, this is how you fuck, and this is what's going on with the sperm and the egg, and oh, people like this a lot. But they never really taught you anything about love, and TV sure as fuck wasn't teaching you anything about love. So, and you know, it's not something people would teach you. Is like, and I'm going off like a man and a woman relationship, or a woman and a woman relationship, or a man and a man relationship, because that's what I know. I'm not going to go into the kind of gender expression side of things. So from that viewpoint, I think that school should give you a basic understanding of not necessarily how to be in a relationship, because that's like there's diversity of thought right there, right? All the different behaviours and ways you can be in a relationship. If anything, it's not taught enough that there are diverse, different ways of being. When I say diverse, I'm not talking about different races and stuff. I'm talking about diversity of thought, right? It's different from what your schools are teaching you now. There's a variety. That's a better word, isn't it? Variety. There's a variety of different ways you can be in a relationship, and I would not just teach like a controlled way of being in a relationship, like you must be this, you must behave like this. I wouldn't teach that. Again, I would teach from an outsider, like an alien, observing humans, looking in. What are the different kind of things that people do in relationships? What are relationships? How do people generally get into them? How do people generally maintain them? How do breakups happen on average? Who do breakups happen to? Why do breakups happen? Why is it good to stay together? Why do some people have multiple partners and one night stands and not stay together with anyone? Why do some people choose that because they like it? Why do some people not like that because they want, stable, strong family stuff, And, parents would come into that, I guess, but that would be more for a different lesson, which is called HE in Home Studies, which I'll discuss in a bit. And yeah, so there'd be a relationship bolt-on to sex education, I think. English language would be taught, very important. It would be taught in primary school, especially. It would be taught to a greater degree, as I hope it is continually being taught in our schools, like how to use the English language, what is it, what are the different punctuation and grammar that you need to use to be able to string a sentence together and stuff like that. There would be something similar to English literature, mixed in with drama and theatre acting. Although I think that is less important and sort of belongs with the arts, I think it's important for people to learn to read, and as a result I'd call this reading lessons. You would read all sorts of stuff, not just English literature, but classics, mainly world literature. You would read together as a class, you would try and follow the words. Special needs students would be given help. People who speak other languages or come from other countries would be given help. They would all try and get up to a standard of being able to read classic literature from England pretty well, and also stuff from overseas that is considered classic by English people, I guess, and useful to learn. Rudyard Kipling's Indian, isn't he? Was he British Indian? I don't know why he's coming to mind. But yeah, there would be world reading as well. And you'd read plays. That'd be a fun thing. This would link in, and you'd do some drama. You'd read plays with each other in the class. You'd take a role as a character, and you'd read together, and that would be quite a fun part of the lesson, I think. And all this is just to help everyone speak English and enunciate their words and speak really well, basically. Then away from the English, you would have languages. My high school was called a language college, so we learnt a low level of lots of different languages at my college. I wish I had learnt, just focused on like 3 and learnt them really well. That would have been fantastic. And that's what I'm advising here is, because I found English people are quite lazy language-wise. If you go to mainland Europe, everyone speaks English, and as a result, lots of people in England don't actually learn a second language. They just go to these countries overseas and go looking for English people to talk to, rather than picking up a few words and from that language of the country they're visiting and trying to use them. So I would give people a choice of 3 languages that they can pick to learn. Make sure they're sure that they want these languages. I think the most common languages in the world, wouldn't they be like Spanish? I think isn't that the most spoken language in the world? It was last time I looked anyway. Chinese would be a big one. English would be, you'd speak that anyway, so perhaps French, because lots of African nations speak French besides France itself. But yeah, apart from that, you'd have one of the big ones, and then you'd have to learn 2 others that you choose, and you'd learn them really well to the point where you could speak them really well. I think that would be important. Because English people are so lazy when it comes to languages, and it just seems so unfair when most Europeans, you speak to any European young person, they know a lot of languages. On average, I think the Europeans I've met know so much more. Hey lady, I only know 2 languages, English and bad English, right? So going back to the relationship studies thing, I did mention that there would be this bit that goes more into family stuff and being a parent and looking after children and stuff like that. And that would actually be the new HE, Home Economics lesson, which would previously have focused on making food. As far as my high school experience goes, HE lessons were about cooking and making food. That would expand into kind of something I'd call family and home studies. And it would, I'm sure, make all the right-wing traditionalists happy. It would be about homemaking. It would be not focused on, hey, women, you're the ones staying at home, get in the kitchen, all that. It would be for men too, and whatever other gender expression you want, or whatever. It would be about just kind of how to do things at home, like things that seem second nature to us as adults. It might not necessarily seem second nature to kids, and part of this would be taught at primary school. You'd basically be teaching kids how to cook things and how to use washing machines and where the pipes from the toilet go and how plumbing is basically functioning and where electrical cables in the house go, and how to look after your house and how to raise kids and do family planning and how to live within a family and try and stop less family disputes from happening. Broken homes are a big thing that happens. Domestic violence might come into it, like trying to stop domestic abuse, making people knowledgeable that can happen to men, trying to stop kids from leaving home, trying to stop homelessness, trying to make kind of small-scale social cohesion between families and people living at homes. So slightly psychological, slightly everything that we think like everyone should know automatically. Some of that would actually be taught in these lessons to kids because they might not know. This would only be a small lesson. I think it would mainly focus on the food and the cooking and the raising of kids and stuff like that. Slightly tied to that would be the next class, which would be a personal finance and business class, which would focus on how to work for an employer, how to be an employer and start your own business, how to keep your finances, keep your receipts, do some basic bookkeeping, do your taxes, look after your bank accounts, that sort of thing. It would slightly tie into the mathematics lesson, which would be the next one. Mathematics. Keep it non-political. That's all you need to do. Mathematics is... I don't know how you can politicize mathematics, but I know that SJWs would fucking try. So keep it non-political. Science. Science, unfortunately, has been massively politicised by SJWs and the far left. And it's very difficult. I had so many role models in science communication, like Professor Brian Cox and stuff, who are now completely ideologically motivated. And you see lots of facets of science and lots of feminists getting into science and corrupting it by adding their bias. They're releasing studies on, what was the gender iceberg thing that came out? How do icebergs affect, like, gender or something? So that there is a lot of using science for bias and politics, and that has to stop, I think. That's been hijacked ever since around 2010-ish, I guess, somewhere around there. Science has been left-leaning, and that's not a good thing. Because science, like mathematics, is meant to be this unbiased thing. It's meant to be like empiricism and taking studies, and at its root, I mean, you really have to keep a discipline of a kind of scientific code of unbiasedness and doing studies and keeping your eyes open for things you weren't expecting. And I think that people were really trying to establish that in science communication only like 5 to 10 years ago. And then it just got completely corrupted with the Great Regression, the culture war stuff coming in. Now science is extremely biased, and it's pretending that it's not, because a lot of these scientists are left-leaning kind of SJWs, and man, it makes it very hard to watch like Phil Moriarty on 60 Symbols, or watch anything by Brian Cox, or I mean, is Richard Dawkins a scientist? He's more of a critic of Christianity than a scientist, but he's extremely biologically motivated these days, and it's corrupted his science completely. So science needs to lose its bias. I'm going to skip one thing here that I've written down in the list and save it to the end, because it is obviously going to be the biggest lesson, and you can probably guess what it's going to be if you know me. So skip that for a moment, and there'd be music lessons. They would focus on classical music to start with, using instruments. You'd have introductions to rock and world music. You'd have a well-stocked soundproof room like I had in my high school, with lots of different instruments, and you try and play them, and you try and play them together, and you try and learn about rhythm and tempo and what makes good music. It'd kind of be a fun lesson. Again, like the English literature and like the art and the game design lessons, not a necessity. I've missed some things here, so I'll go back. Talking about the things that would be necessity, there would be engineering lessons, and that would also go with DT, design technology, and graphic design. In these lessons you would make things. You would physically build things. You would learn about materials, It would go quite well with the physics lessons. You would learn like tensile strength and how much weight you put on something before it can collapse, and how different materials get affected by pressure and weight and things in the environment, like heat and atmosphere, wind. You would you would try and build a variety of different things, and you would learn about things that you could build, and you would learn how to build basic things. It would be a really, I think you would have to focus on it. It would have to be one of the biggest lessons actually. There'd have to be a lot of room on the timetable for this engineering and building course and DT and stuff. You'd do like woodwork, you would do metalwork, you would create things that would help people. You would create things to add onto your house, you would build things. I guess it's quite a manly subject, but I think women would have to get involved in it too. You know, not just putting up shelves, although that could be one of the short beginner lessons or something. You know, here, follow these instructions correctly, put up a shelf. Don't fucking hammer your finger. But it would move way beyond that, and by the end of it you'd be building some really proper useful stuff, I think. There would be, this isn't a lesson, but there would be special needs and mental health tutors and language tutors that are assigned to certain groups of kids that aren't doing as well, just to help them get through the lessons. They would sit on the table with the special needs kids, and that wouldn't be to downgrade those kids or to isolate them or anything. It would just be I guess other kids would be able to tell that these kids are weaker at learning, and that's why they've got the special needs tutor, but the kids would be taught to respect that. To link up close to the sex education lessons and the family studies lessons, I guess, there would be health lessons. I don't know what to call it, I just call it health, maybe health studies. You'd learn personal health, you'd learn hospitality, hygiene, a bit of anatomy, although that would mainly slot into biology, I think. But you'd learn a bit of it here. Elderly and disabled care, caring for people, being a carer, looking after yourself, fitness, which would lead into the PE lessons, physical education. Yeah, that would be something that I think kids would need just to maintain their own health and to stop themselves hurting themselves and getting into trouble with like germs and bacteria and getting disease from just a lot of what's good about modern society and life compared to like medieval society and life is that we have a basic understanding of hygiene. And I think hygiene would be a big part of it. Like, you would learn about bacteria and viruses and where they are in the home and how you can contract stuff, and, you know, always boil standing water if you're trying to survive out in a, like, island or a jungle or something. Just stuff like that, really. And then there would be work experience programs. My one wasn't very rigorous when I was at high school, and I think I would enhance that and try and get teachers more involved with getting all students into work experience and trying to get all students to have at least one real job when they're 16. Whether they keep it or not, at least they've had that first job and they know about what getting work in the real life could be like. And then I'll jump back to like the biggest lesson, the most important lesson. What do you think it's going to be? It's the one I haven't said yet, unless you've thought of one that I haven't said yet, that in which case bring it up. But history, okay? This is the biggest lesson that you should learn in school. And I've actually taken this concept called big history that they were pushing. I'm not sure if their version is quite what my version was, but from what I can guess, when people have said big history, and the way I use it, is a lot of history lessons have focused only on human history. That's not right. That's not history. History needs to be taught more objectively than that, and we shouldn't just focus on humans. History should be everything. History should be time. It's time studies, right? It would go into scale studies, which I talked about at the start, like my own concoction of trying to perceive like the depth of time, which is so massive. So I've written here, big history, it includes non-human history. It teaches historicity first, and how truth of history is difficult or maybe impossible to totally achieve. So history is told by the victors, not the vanquished. History includes many people's different viewpoints. History is broken by the records we're able to obtain. History is broken by people who lie when they're telling historical accounts for their own gains. History is broken by people who in the past burn masses of historical records and things. I think there was a big destruction of historical records once. I think it was in Egypt somewhere. I'll have to look back. Something about Alexandria, I remember. Yeah, the Library of Alexandria, created by Ptolemy of Lagos, was a general under Alexander the Great. The library is most famous for having been burnt down. Yeah, I knew it was something like that. So there are times in history where you don't know the history because people in the past have done mass erasure of history, which is arguably something that might be happening now in some places. Wikipedia being a prime culprit, I think. I think it's being eaten by left-wing bias, and it is the scraps that go on behind the scenes of each article between just forumites, basically, biased forumites, who think they have superiority and control. These things do nothing for our remembrance of history. And we should teach kids, before we get into big history, we should teach them like how history is lost and history is flawed and there can be no true retrieving of history. But that we should try, and the things we do remember and the things we do know can give us great joy. They can also give us great understanding of our faults and how to improve ourselves. And we should really strive to try and keep history unbiased, which, you know, maybe we'll have better records of history in the year 3000 of the year 2000, but arguably we don't have very good records from the year 2000 of the history of the year 1000 maybe, and up to 100 and 0 and way back further than that. As I say, we'd be teaching history not just of humans, but we'd be teaching all the ancient biological history. Dinosaurs would come into it, which I'm sure people would be happy about. No more of this Jurassic Park stuff where raptors are the size of humans, where they should be the size of chickens. Those films have really, they've probably badly educated a lot of children, I think, about dinosaurs. But you go back further than that, you go back to when humans, you'd follow human timeline back to when we were derived from fish, and trilobites and things, and the splitting of the cells, and the biological creation of sex out of nothing, just so like students would get a grasp that what sex actually is, away from all the social crap that we have now that describes sex. It's an actual scientific thing as well, for duplication. And yeah, it would be the most important subject once you got into it. And you would go chronologically, I think. You would talk about the flaws first of teaching history, and how anything that would be told to kids would not be a full picture, and they would have to learn more by themselves to get more of a full picture of history, but you would try and go year by year, and you describe that some parts of history would be condensed because there's no way you could go year by year, because you wouldn't have enough historical records for some years, and you would have far too much historical records if you're trying to describe the history of the 2010s, perhaps. So you would have to ignore tons from recent history because we record everything now, and you would have to not be able to tell enough of proper ancient prehistoric history because we had hardly any records, and it's such a densely long period of time without records that it's difficult to tell. So you'd condense that, and you would open up that side, sort of thing, and so you'd have to explain to kids that there's a scale from here to here where time is condensed, and there's a scale from here to here where we'll go year by year with time and describe what happened, and there's a scale here where time is expanded. Yeah, it would be, I think history really needs to be worked on a lot in terms of education, and it would be the biggest lesson you'd have to teach in school because it's very important and very difficult to teach. So there's my ideal school and my ideal school subjects and how they be taught. I'm sure each individual person will have their own variant of what their ideal school is. It's kind of like a utopia, isn't it? Everyone has their own utopia, and utopia is meant to mean your ideal version of the future. What is a beautiful ideal future? A good future. But it's always created by one person's view, and I've learnt in recent years that all utopias are dystopias. A dystopia being an evil, bad future, a dark future. That's what a utopia is, because it's one particular person's view of what the future should be, which, it turns out, isn't shared by most other people. And the same can be said for my version of the school system. You know, I'm a layman, I'm not a school professor. I'm sure other people would find all this completely inefficient. But what I want to get away from is the far left bias in universities and schools that is teaching segregation, is teaching us to be racist against white people in particular, and actually, arguably, because of the soft bigotry of low expectations, racist to black people and Middle Eastern people and everyone else. So they're not very good at that, are they? The SJWs, they're not very good at fighting racism. They end up just becoming racists themselves. So yeah, it's not really working out. I'd remove all that stuff. I would still teach, you know, I'd teach you that people think these things. That's the important stuff. Like, I wouldn't say, let's not teach any stuff about trans people and all the made-up gender identities, like cloud gender or whatever, ambigender, all this fashionable terminology for stuff that doesn't represent scientifically biological sex. Men, women, sometimes mutations in the middle, calling someone who's gone trans male to female, calling them a female, someone who's gone trans female to male, calling them a male, but recognizing that they are trans. I would teach them that these viewpoints exist, you know. I would teach them as an outsider. I've said this a few times, like for each lesson, if you're going to teach about something that exists in the real world, you teach it to the kid as if they're an outsider looking in at this peculiar human behaviour that is strange to them, and teach them the dangers of adopting any of these viewpoints before they try themselves and adopt any of these viewpoints. What's wrong about it? How could they be attacked if they decide to become part of an ideological movement or a gender, or a religion, or a sexuality. You know, these are things that I think kids could do with knowing before they get covered in politics and gender and race. We got a lot of fixing to do, but that's just my opinion. I don't have an outro. See you later, fools. Bye, punks.